Thank you very much. It's first, being the last, I assume that I should thank the organizers for a great conference. And I must say that coming just after a session on wine is pretty hard, because my next move will be to go get a glass of wine, not from Argentina, and I don't want to prevent others from doing so. So this is joint work with Jonathan Eaton and Sam Cordum. It took us roughly 10 years to essentially complete the paper. It's virtually completed. I've said that for the last 5 years, I must say. So what do we try to do here? Our theoretical vision is that trade is the result of a global search by firms for suppliers and for customers. And to include this vision and this connection with labor markets, we believe that suppliers of intermediates potentially replace firms, production workers. The same firms, and that was also an essential component of our vision. It was hard to make it work, but the same firms act both as buyers and as suppliers, importers and exporters. So what does it imply? It implies that if there's some fixed point somewhere, because I'm selling to Carlo, who's selling to Isabel, and Isabel is selling to me. So at the same time, we're buyers and sellers, and we need to have this roundabout element that should be captured in the theory. Here, search is stochastic, random, but buyers can choose the best supplier or suppliers they encounter. One important element is that outcomes are granular. There's a finite integer number of suppliers and buyer, as is in the data. Another element in our vision, I'm not sure it's a vision, but that's how we see things. Firms' choices shape the production technology. If it is cost effective, a firm can replace workers and perform a task with an intermediate purchased domestically or imported. We make no difference, except for the costs, between domestic suppliers and foreign suppliers. That allows us to have many dimensions of heterogeneity. First, and exogenously, we have firm efficiency and the number of tasks. You'll see that we'll have tasks that feature centrally in the paper. But then the firm unit cost is totally endogenous. The labor share of production cost is also endogenous. The number of buyers to the number of suppliers is partly endogenous. So this is what we wanted to integrate in our grand vision. How do we do this? We use a parsimonious tractable model. And I think that Sam has proved along the years that he's able to deliver that kind of product with a small set of parameters other than bilateral search frictions. Wholesalers, so we'll have wholesalers, producer, retailers, and households. And we'll have no Dixit-Stiglitz preferences. So there is no profits, no fixed cost, because search friction will do the job. The empirical scope will be trying to connect the theory to granular buyer-seller transactions, very similar to those that Isabel has been using. She used it in the longitudinal dimension. We use it in a given year. We don't use product. She used product prominently. And we'll connect that to aggregates. So as well as to firm-level data on exporting and labor shares, as well as to aggregate bilateral trade around the world. And continuing a style that we started, at least for me, with in our first paper with the Eaton and Cordum, we have empirical analogs of all the objects in the theory. Okay, so I'm trying to eliminate, oh, that's good. The implications. So this is the grand slide. We believe it explains existing findings, solves some puzzles, and extends the reach of existing theory. It's important for us that all the predictions that we had in EKK1 and the Melitz type model survive, in particular the selection into export. Yet search frictions act like and replace a fixed cost to enter a market with no role for profits. So I'm talking about puzzles. So one of the puzzle is, why doesn't the number of exporters scale with bilateral trade share as predicted in MELITS or EKK1? Well, we'll see that the first buyer in the market makes a firm an exporter, so subsequent buyers don't matter for export status. So it'll be important to see that, again, to become an exporter, you just need to have one buyer. But once you have a second one, it's going to change things, okay? And we'll see how what this implies. Another thing we would like to look at is why there's such huge variations in sales per exporter across country pairs, positively correlated with bilateral trade flows. In existing theory, sales per exporter is invariant to iceberg costs, but positively correlated with bilateral fixed costs. However, greater variation in bilateral fixed costs might explain the huge variation in X over N, but would dampen variation in bilateral trade, requiring even more variation in the iceberg trade costs to feed the bilateral trade. However, such costs, iceberg trade costs, are thought to be already very high, and that would not exactly fit the bill. In our theory, sales per exporter is invariant to iceberg costs, but negatively related to bilateral search frictions. So again, search frictions here are such that the more such friction there are, the more firms potentially enter and make small firms exporting to only having only one buyer more frequent. So we'll see that a little more. Letting us explain the data while reducing the reliance on iceberg trade costs. We identify the bilateral search friction from the variation in buyers per exporter that we have in the data. And as we've said, we can speak of trade and labor simultaneously, both at the firm level and NGE. Okay, the literature, I think this is important. The names are important. Chaney has been looking at these kind of questions. Oberfield also has this, but there is nothing like replacing some tasks by imports from suppliers. Bernard have looked at, and Etal have looked at other, this kind of data for Norway. There's a paper by Taibout in Eton. Isabelle Méjean has also looked at these search technology and search frictions, showing how smaller firms are inefficiently protected by search frictions. She used that and looked at that at the level of individual goods. And then there are two different literature, the one on superstar firms, where we see there's a reduction in labor shares, which we look at, and Acemoglu et al., we look at the role of tasks in production. And this is important for us. So one key result here, which is the following. I was asking the question, why do bilateral sales per exporter X over N vary so much across country pairs? So I is the origin, N is the destination, and based on our theory, you can write X over N as Xn I over N and I being the number of exporters, is equal to something that we call RNI, the number of relationships. So assume that an exporter has one buyer, it's going to have one relationship. If it has two, it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's the number of exporter times the average number of buyers per exporter. So here, based on our theory, bilateral buyers per seller varies only with bilateral search frictions, even though the purchase, the X over B doesn't vary bilaterally, but only based on the destination. So this is important because that gives us some elements and drives us empirically. So we'll be able to identify bilateral search friction this way, and we'll see that they are a huge contributor to overall trade frictions. And indeed, these bilateral search frictions provide an excellent account of variation in X over N, leaving a more modest role for iceberg costs. Okay, so I have some graphs that I will show, but I will not comment on. The first thing I believe is to look at table 1. Table 1 has some similar number or close number that we had in EKK1. The coefficient on the trade share of France across countries was a little above that. But our theory would have told us at that time, and Melitz would have told us that the coefficient should be 1 on pi NF. And that's at odds with what we see here. That was at odds with what we had before, and we didn't pay attention to that fact, and no referee either, by the way. But the theory we'll have here will tell us that the log of the relationships from, that is again, the number of buyers there are for French exporter there are in a given country, is 1/1 for the trade share. So this is what we have in the data that's completely in line with the theory. And we see the number of, average number of buyers, okay, reconciling the two, giving us the sum of the first and the third line being the total. Then we can have a bunch of graphs that's just for you to present the moments I'm going to use. So we're going to use the number of French exporters. We're going to use the number of French relationships. We will use the mean number of buyers per French exporter. That will be moments. We'll use also deciles or centiles of the distributions of buyers for French exporters. As you can see, there's a lot of variation. There are very little, small numbers for the median, but at the 99th percentile, there's lots of number of buyers that are much larger, okay, from that have lots of buyers. Then we can look at selection, the fact that there is indeed selection, not everyone exports. And this is done using this kind of graph where we have those firms that export to Germany, but Germany and Belgium, Germany and Netherlands, Portugal, etc. So this gives us the number of customers in Germany per French exporter exporting also elsewhere. Okay, then we can do the same for sales ratio. And the reverse is looking at French suppliers per buyer. That is, since we can observe, I didn't say anything, but since we can observe for any French exporter, the identity of the buyer, we know, of course, how many buyers that firm has, but take a given buyer, we can also know how many suppliers it has in France. Okay, so we can look at that and have a model for that. Finally, we'll be using what we call labor shares. So it's the share of skilled labor cost into production costs. So 20% of the firm have zero skilled labor, and 50% of the firms have zero unskilled labor. Okay, this will be elements in our model. Okay, let me jump to the theory. So we have a production function that is Cobb-Douglas across skills. So we have K skills. In the application, we'll have 3 skills, 1 administrative, 0, which cannot be outsourced, and 2 skilled tasks, skilled and unskilled production. We have the usual cost function, and this is CS over the different tasks within skills. The CS part is important because it tells you that if you can find a good supplier, you're going to alter your use of that task towards that excellent supplier. This is here we have mu and I, which gives us the distribution, the cost distribution, which is the usual Pareto stuff. And here we'll have the cost, which will be the minimum of the lowest price available among all the suppliers the firm meets, and the ratio of the labor cost, the wage, divided by a Fréchet shock affecting the efficiency of skill K in firm J. Okay, so we also have retailers that sell locally to local households. They have the same efficiency and same input structure as producers. Now, that was production. Now, the firm-to-firm matching. The firm-to-firm matching is random. most efficient sellers meet more potential buyers locally or internationally. This is Poisson. Hence, we have an integer number of potential buyers. For the buyer, the integer number of potential sellers for a given task. A firm is active if it has at least one active buyer. We have a matching intensity, which is lambda k and I, in which lambda and I captures the matching friction. Okay, the larger lambda, the lower the matching friction, because that means that you're going to meet more persons. If you meet more persons, that's going to have an effect on the competition. Okay, and that's going to be bad in some sense for the small firms. Then you can show that in equilibrium, the distribution, the measure of firms with a given cost is going to be epsilon NC theta, and that epsilon is the outcome of a fixed point that will in fact take all countries in the world. The decision to keep workers or to buy from suppliers, and that will in fact make the economy more efficient. Okay, if you compare that to an economy with no such things, you just have epsilon that disappears, and that makes the economy more efficient. Final thing here is the fact that we have a match. We think of it as, you know, as in search models, a matching. So the number of encounters or matches between a buyer and a seller with cost C has this shape. And as you can see, there might be more than constant returns, potentially increasing returns depending on the value of phi and gamma. If 2 minus phi minus gamma is greater than 1, then you have increasing returns in the matching function. We'll estimate phi and gamma and show you that indeed they are increasing returns. Okay, we have an aggregate equilibrium in which you have a services sector. Services are sold to household as final consumption. This sector also provides intermediate to the goods sector. The goods sector provides intermediate to the service sector via retailers. We have three types of labor, as I've said: administrative, skilled and unskilled. The administrative cannot be outsourced, but they are all employed in both sectors and mobile. Trade, goods are traded internationally when services are local. And then we write the labor shares and wages, which are endogenous when there is outsourcing. Okay, so I don't have a sense of how much time I have left, but I think like 4 or 5 minutes, I guess. Relationships clearly are related to the number of buyers in a country, the probability of outsourcing, and the market share. So this gives us ways to estimate the whole things because some of these are measured directly. Then we can also look at estimate lambda and I, estimate the elasticity of buyers per seller with respect to the search parameter. The number of NNI of 1 is the number of exporters that has one buyer. So this gives us a sense of how the number of buyers that we observe in the data varies with lambda, the mean number of buyers per seller. So we really have empirical counterparts to all the elements in the theory. We can also look at importers, for which we also have a theoretical counterpart, and of course data coming from tech and WIOD. One element that I haven't precisely described is the fact that we have a random number of tasks. Firms have a random number of tasks that can go from, let me go from 1 to 4,000. So this is the number of tasks. So some firms are 1, this is random, 4, 16, etc. And by using the French labor share, the share of skilled and unskilled labor share in production, you can estimate the distribution. And why do we need to have so many tasks in some firms, typically because you have firms that have lots of buyers. So what we do is we use the number of buyers that can be super large to estimate how firms replace some of their workers to exactly buy from these suppliers. So you need this. So this is what we estimate. Let me come back. So the estimation is done usually by simulated maximum likelihood. We use VAT data for 2005, the DADS for skills, FICUS for total production costs, all that in 2005. And then other parameters are calibrated to aggregate data. In particular, the labor shares in the goods sector by skills, share of skills. The number of exporters, importers are taken from tech data. So these are the results. So I mentioned the value of gamma and phi. The sum is 0.6, meaning that 2 minus 0.6 is 1.4. So there are increasing returns in matching. Okay, we also estimate the lambdas. We do that we have a procedure to estimate the lambdas even outside 2005. So these are not observed, but we just derive it from all the elements in the model. And what matters here, I guess, is to say that if you think of market shares, then even controlling for distance, there's a strong role for the trade frictions. Okay, trade frictions, increasing trade frictions increase market share. And even if you focus on the larger countries, then you'll be seeing that the role of distance decreases. So I think that the take we have from these two tables is that the trade costs, the search frictions, I'm sorry, matter a lot. They're related clearly to distance, to the trade share. And again, someone mentioned the law of one price before. If the search friction, the lambda ni is the inverse of the trade friction. So lambda ni is the efficiency in matching, if you want, the intensity. So if intensity is very large between two countries, between a pair of countries, then pi and I, the market share will be very large. Okay, so that means that the most efficient firms will be able to sell to many buyers. So it's important to see that there is no such thing. Well, there is clearly an intensive margin, but the intensive margin is mostly played by the number of buyers. The extensive margin is you enter, you become an exporter or not, and you will sell a lot in a given country if you have multiple buyers. Okay, this is how this works. The element of how much you sell depends essentially on the type of buyers you meet, and they will not play a big role. We performs our counterfactuals. So interestingly, we're able to reproduce all the results in EKK1 without fixed costs. We're able to look at other things such as the Brexit. Why do I say that? So assuming that there are increases in D and decreases in lambda, that is, the efficiency decreases, but the D increases. Why do I say Boris Johnson wins? Because typically that essentially means that the manufacturers' employment increases, mostly because the local firms start to sell, whereas they were not selling anything. Well, they were selling much less before. Indeed, the nominal wage of production workers will increase. However, the real wage will decrease. But from a political economy viewpoint, I guess that's what he was expecting. We also are able to look at, because we have the unskilled wages and the skilled wages, which are determined in equilibrium, we're able to look at the effects of trade on inequality, real and nominal effects, employment in manufacturers, for instance, versus services. Okay, So my conclusion is we believe that we are able to capture all facts in EKK1, explain some remaining puzzles. The one I mentioned was the role of relationships versus exporters distinction, and the role of buyers, which appears to be extremely important in what we find, which was a no role in theories before. We're able to have a quantitative assessment of source frictions versus fixed costs. And we believe that search frictions play at least as much a role as the fixed cost or the trade costs. There is evidence of increasing returns in matching. And the interesting aspect, and that's why I embarked in this research, was to be able to connect trade and labor in a very natural way, very much like we were seeing for robots. So you import robots, you replace the robots, you replace workers with the robots, and that's exactly something we have here, even though we don't pay attention to the type of product which is important. But that's exactly the direction what we're trying to have. Clearly, search frictions benefit the small and inefficient firms at the expense of costs and prices. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. I think we have a few minutes left for some questions. If there's anyone from the panel, Francis, if you stop sharing your screen, or maybe no, leave it, because maybe we can go back to question. Any question from the panel? Because I had one on one thing that you said. There is this comment by, so I just want to have your opinion on that. There is this comment by Paul Antras saying that because of the COVID shock and the pandemic, he expects trade to have a significant slowdown, which is persistent over time, because it will be more difficult for people to meet physically, and therefore essentially the search frictions would actually increase. It would be harder to sign contracts. So it seems that your quantitative assessments goes in the same direction.
Yes.
Have you been able to, I don't know, provide any, since you're mentioning it, any extent of this shock? I mean, any quantification in terms of what we can expect?
We do a counterfactual exercise, but since we have no sense of the magnitude of the changes in DNI and lambda NI, we're just doing something, and that it has to be taken with a pinch of salt, to say the least. It gives directions, and it gives, so the difference between the Brexit and the COVID style is multilateral, whereas Brexit is bilateral, and that helps us contrast the two outcomes. It goes in the way that I understand Paul Antras was saying, but it's hard to say that we have pinned down a number.
There's no other question or reaction?
Everybody's exhausted?
Yeah, probably, from 3 days of conferences, which was very interesting in any case. I'll stop here as, oh, Gianmarco, maybe you have...
You didn't see me. I mean, this is...
Sorry.
So clear, this is a very dense paper, so maybe
Yeah,
I'm asking a silly question, but so you have that matching function in which, so there are various things that are making it, I mean, that are introducing heterogeneity in the results, of course. So one thing that I think you said was that more productive firms have a higher probability of matching with a larger number of customers or suppliers?
No, well, this is, in fact, as you can see from, I don't know if you see my screen again.
Yeah.
The exporters meet more buyers.
Okay.
More efficient. But it doesn't work in reverse.
Okay.
We tried, it doesn't work. It's super hard, and we couldn't. What you need to have is something that keeps that shape. You see the shape here, which is C of theta.
Yeah.
to stay in the same, you need to make things work in a world that is c to the power theta. You can make it happen in a world in which efficient sellers meet more buyers. You cannot make it happen in a world in which more efficient buyers meet more sellers.
I see.
But still, there is this matching, and there is this externality imposed on by the small buyers or the small sellers, which is this measure of phi and gamma in the matching function.
I mean, that's so very interesting, because I thought that would be isomorphic if you inverted if you move the C from Sn to Bn. But then what you're saying is that the solution is not actually the same, and it's very hard to find a solution.
Yes.
Okay.